Rachel Reeves has just announced the budget. We react to it on today's episode of Cross Section. We unpack what some of these measures will mean and how, as Christians, we can respond. We also talk about the Supreme Court ruling in Northern Ireland about religious education and talk about this new trial testing out puberty blockers on children. This is an episode that you do not want to miss. Hello and welcome back to Cross Section. Our episode is out slightly late this week, and that is because we are recording live straight after the budget has been announced. We will get onto that later in the episode, but for now, my name is Zanna and I am joined by Danny and Mark in the studio. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Happy Budget Day.
Happy Budget Day. And Peter over in Northern Ireland. Welcome. So before we kind of get into our main conversations, we're going to do what we love to do, have a little moment of what stories have caught our eyes in the news this week. Danny, do you want to kick us off something that's you've noticed that you want to bring?
Well, one fascinating story that I've seen a bit about this week is the rise of AI worship. I don't know if you've ever come across the worship artist Solomon Ray. Well, you will never have come across him in real life because he is an AI creation, and he has been topping the gospel charts in the US with his entirely AI worship. He has an AI Christmas album EP out, and it raises all sorts of fascinating questions. We've had AI music, entirely AI albums. What about AI worship? Can an AI-generated worship song lead us into the presence of God? Can it enable us to worship God? Or is the disembodiedness of AI totally corrupting what it means to worship God? But hey, I think we'll come back to this at some point.
Yeah, it definitely asks a lot of questions. It's a funny thought, isn't it, that something that doesn't kind of have a soul is writing lyrics about praising God. It's a very odd thought. But yes, I guess no one will be able to see that live because, would it turn into like an ABBA Voyage thing where they've got like a weird image that's singing on the stage? Weird thoughts. What about you, Peter? Something that you want to bring?
Yeah, well, I mean, I saw Forrest Frank commenting on that, and I do think it's interesting. It might get to the heart of worship music. I think there's lots of questions around that. But I was taken by the Wreath Lectures. Rutger Bregman is giving those. There was a sort of tangential story where a line he had about Donald Trump was cut out by the lawyers. He says it's censorship. I think it's just the reality of the world we live in. It wasn't going to be a defensible statement from a claim, I think. But anyway, he's talking about a moral revolution. And I think it might be something we come back to because he's a historian who wrote a book, Humankind. He's looking at a kind of what utopian future might look like. And his dad was interestingly a preacher. He doesn't come from a faith perspective, but he seems to be. He's looking at Wilberforce and the Clapham sect as a small community who made a massive difference in the world. So when he says more on that, I suspect we'll look at it again and see, can you have a moral revolution without agreeing the moral framework on which that is based, which would seem to be right up our street.
Our favourite thing to do is slightly tease a story and say we're going to come back to it. I feel like we're very good at that.
But we store up quite a few stories that we may eventually get to.
There will come a point. Mark, do you have anything? Or, I mean, you're very excited about the budget, so maybe that's your story that you're
really
going to bring.
The budget is the only thing on my mind at the moment. No, I don't think I do have anything to add.
That's fine. We will get straight into our kind of first big story, which is kind of huge. It kind of came out last week. Northern Ireland Supreme Court ruling about RE. Peter, I'm going to come straight to you on this because you have really helpfully unpacked this. You and David Smith, our head of Northern Ireland, have put out an article as well that will be linked. But could you kind of explain the nuance around what this actually means? Because it feels like there have been, headlines that would suggest one thing, and it's kind of hard to know what's actually happening with the story. So, yes, that would be very helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, firstly, I think we need to acknowledge the Northern Ireland takeover. Mark's joining us today. We've got up to 50% of this show, so it's fantastic. Yes, Mark's great. November, so just last week, 19th of November, Supreme Court issue a landmark ruling on religious education and collective worship in schools, state-controlled schools in Northern Ireland. And the court said basically the current arrangements failed to meet human rights requirements, and that they said it should be objective, critical, and pluralistic. Basically, a parent who, coming from a humanist background, was withdrawing their child and felt that withdrawal alone wasn't kind of sufficient. It put too much burden on the parents and it risked the child being stigmatized. And basically the court has agreed with that. That happened initially, then it went on appeal, it went the other way, and now it's the Supreme Court have said, okay, that is true. Now, what this is being portrayed as by one group of people is kind of religion is now out. Religion, the teaching of religion is unlawful in Northern Ireland. Well, it's unlawful technically exactly in its current form, but the court has been very clear that RE, based on the Holy Scriptures, based on the Bible, is still central, is still legal. In fact, not just is legal, it is mandatory that that is taught in schools. And so I think there's been some really unfortunate headlines. We'll talk more maybe about the detail, but I think that's a really important point to stress. It's so important in this moment of chaos and kind of misinformation, disinformation, and fake news that we speak accurately about these things. And so, we really want to get into the detail of the case perhaps in a minute, but it has not banned Christian teaching from schools. It will change some of what's happening, but fundamentally, you're still allowed to teach in RE around Christianity. In fact, you have to, and it has to be based on the Holy Scriptures, and you're still supposed to have a daily act of collective worship. That, interestingly, is also the law right across the UK. This is not uniquely Northern Ireland. I guess the fear is that seems to be more in abeyance in England, even though it's supposed to be the law, and we don't want to go that direction.
That's super helpful because it can be easy to just see a headline and think you understand the story. And yes, we all understand what clickbait is, and it can cause panic and cause confusion. So thank you for explaining that. Mark, you were at school slightly more recently than Peter in Northern Ireland. So yeah, would you be able to kind of chat a little bit about your experience of RE at school? What are your thoughts as you respond to this story?
Sure. Well, I do think it is a world of its own, really, in Northern Ireland. The key idea is it's not pluralistic, and this judgment is obviously about getting it to that place. I mean, I think back to lunchtimes where grace was said, and it was just taken as given, There was never any challenge to that. I do think there is something to lament about. We're not in that place anymore. But obviously, we can't stay in that place of lament. We need to say, how is this an opportunity? How is this an opportunity to advance and share the good news of the gospel amongst other religious teaching? I think as Christians, we shouldn't be threatened by that. I think when we see teaching of other religions as a threat, we get into sort of a scary and dangerous place. But when we see it as an opportunity to go, how do we do pluralism well? How do we do it differently? Then a lot of good can come from that.
Really helpful. What would you guys kind of say as the role of the church in this? Like, I mean, Peter, I saw, some suggestions that you guys put out about how to respond and what that looks like.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things we can separate out. So the teaching of RE is largely objective and critical and plural, but based on Christianity as the main religion within Northern Ireland and within the UK. So I think the teaching of it, particularly at secondary school, it's always done in the context of other religions. But Christianity is given a central place because of that history. And again, perhaps a reminder for people, it's similar to here, or similar to you guys in England and Wales. The schools were set up by the churches almost exclusively. And then in the kind of 1930s, 1940s, as the state became more involved in education, the churches handed a lot of those schools over, but kept seats on the board and kept some core ethos ideas because they had set them up. And that's the deal that the state and we as a culture made. So that's the reason for the history. And then, so I think, as I say, RE is relatively straightforward, particularly as you get older. I think for younger children, there's a little bit more complexity, but fundamentally, they're going to change the syllabus a little bit, be clearer that it should be taught as what's objective, and we should critically engage. I have no problem with that. Christianity is objectively true. The evidence for that is overwhelming. That's great. Let's have the conversation. I think the daily act of collective worship is a little bit trickier just to navigate. Look, the legislation is saying that still has to be premised on Christian basis. It just can't be denominational. That's the only thing. And I think we as churches and Christians are going to have to navigate some of that space. It is for us as Christians and as churches to persuade people, to encourage people that this is true and what that means to kind of come in an act of worship and to give up your lives and become Christians. That is not the school's job. And I actually don't think it's very healthy when schools do that. But they can lead and invite others in to help lead in a daily act of collective worship. That will remain and is the law. And our Minister for Education is looking at what that means going forward and how we do that better. And so I think there's good conversations to be had, but those distinctions are probably really important. And then there is an opportunity beyond that for SU groups, for other youth agencies to come in and run things at lunchtime, to run things after school. And that's where you're persuasive to say, oh, I think like this thing is not only true, but is life-changing. Come into that. That's entirely appropriate and that's fine. And people get choice in that. So it's trying to that fine balance of understanding our Christian history and culture that has shaped so much of who we are without just presuming that everybody is and kind of teaching in that way. And there's a little bit of work to be done in navigating that.
I think, so the English system is different.
Mm.
I found it fascinating reading through the judgment, learning about the transferor council or transfer representatives council of the churches that did hand over, and the difference then between those and the Catholic church that didn't hand over their schools. In England, it is different. You have a large number, particularly of primary schools, run by the Anglican, mostly from the Anglican church and the Catholic church, that are not in the same category as state schools. They have their own board of education. They still follow the national curriculum. They are still government-funded schools, but their operation does have quite a reasonable amount of autonomy in how they operate in terms of the teaching of RE and, well, attachment to churches. Now, personally, I went to two very different schools. My primary education was at the extremely Christian end of the spectrum. It was an independent school founded by my church in the 1980s, specifically because the parents in the church wanted to provide a distinctly Christian education that would help people grow in their faith as well as their education. I then went to secondary school, a large comprehensive school where the idea of a daily active worship was not even faintly addressed. Every week we would have an assembly where we might, if you're lucky, pause for thought for a moment. So, and this was a little while ago. So I think, wow, the idea of having collective worship in mainstream schools is good. I think the opportunity for Christians to be involved with it is good. I think we also have to face reality and the fact that certainly in England, it's not something that is often done. And actually, I want Christian influence in schools to be a positive, real thing and not just hanging on to something that is technically in the law but isn't actually done.
Mm. Yeah, helpful. I was just thinking as you were speaking, it's funny as well, the kind of rise in popularity, I'm sure you guys have seen this, of primary school bangers and how, you saw at Glastonbury them singing things like Shine, Jesus, Shine and, I'm oiling my lamp, that one. Is that what it's called? I don't know. But yeah, it's just interesting, isn't it, as well, the impact. But the people see that as like a good thing as well. I mean, I'm sure they don't think about what they're singing, but just how many people's kind of primary school experience was tied to that is just...
I think that's the really positive side of it. It does introduce people to Christianity who wouldn't otherwise have it in their lives. I mean, the slightly more negative side of that is people's paying lip service to a culture that they don't believe in and don't agree with, and we don't want to see that happen. The benefit of this new opportunity really is presenting Christianity as a choice amongst others and something that requires active participation rather than just sitting back and letting it happen.
Yeah, really helpful as we kind of, think about that. But yes, I would recommend you kind of read some of the things linked in the show notes if you want to think about it more. There's lots of helpful stuff to kind of help you process it and think about it. But we are now going to move into the budget. Woohoo! I mean, Mark has been waiting for this moment all year. It's actually a significant anniversary for us because the first episode of Cross Section that we recorded in the studio was reacting to the budget last year. So happy anniversary to that as well. Peter, I'm sure you were feeling FOMO when you weren't with us all in one of our meeting rooms watching the budget together.
You weirdos. I was convinced Danny had locked some people in there and taken them hostage to make everybody watch the budget with them.
Entirely voluntary.
Yeah.
It was indeed. Just to say, we are recording this at about 2 p.m. Kemi Badenoch is probably, I don't know if she's still speaking, but anyway, that is where we are. We're so fresh off it. So our thoughts are all very new, even though there was kind of a lot of speculation before. So we did have some things teed up. But I'm going to come straight to you, Danny. Do you want to give us a really quick summary?
I'll give you the really quick summary. The budget was leaked an hour before it was delivered by the OBR. There's been a lot of apologies, but even before that, it had been trailed so extensively in the press that everyone knew virtually everything that was going to come within this budget. The main tax-raising measure is by freezing the thresholds of income tax and other rates of tax, which is what we call fiscal drag. It's one of my favourite economic terms. There's a bunch of other tax-raising measures, gambling duties, milkshake tax, mansion tax. Those are not huge revenue-generating things.
Not the milkshake tax?
The milkshake tax, I don't think it's going to raise very much. The mansion tax will raise about 400 million by 2030, 2031. It's not that much money in the grand scheme of things. There are then a bunch of spending decisions that, again, have been very heavily trailed. The two-child limit on universal credit and tax credits has been lifted. This is not a two-child limit on child benefit. Very confusing, because it's often referred to as the two-child benefit cap. Doesn't relate to child benefit. Very confusing. This will change next year. So what we're seeing in this budget is a lot of the spending decisions happening quite quickly, coming into force next year or the year after, but a lot of the revenue generating ideas not coming onto stream until 29 or 2030. So actually, the pain is coming later in the budget. So it means that in the 5-year projection across the budget, they can say, oh, by the end of this 5-year projection, the debt as a share of government spending will be reducing, but actually that won't start to happen until the final 2 years, and that final 2 years is 2029 when we're expecting a general election. Are you telling me these things aren't going to change again by the time we get to a general election? So there's a lot of kind of financial jiggery-pokery going on. It's been described as a smorgasbord of tax rises. It had been suggested that they would raise income tax, which would have broke the manifesto pledge. They haven't done that. I'm not sure where this leaves the government. The Labour Party benchers were very, very happy with the change to the child benefit policy, but it is interesting. Support around this. We've done some polling, and we found that 6 out of 10 evangelicals support removing the cap. But in the general public, 6 out of 10 support retaining the cap. And in fact, 53% of Labour voters last year support retaining the cap. So while it was very heavily cheered by Labour MPs, and they'd been campaigning for it for some time, opinion across the country is more mixed.
I think that is the big takeaway, really. There's lots of talk about reducing child poverty. We all want to see that, but does it necessarily lead to it? And is there support across the electorate for it? Danny, I think you mentioned the stealth taxes are the headline, really, for this budget. And some of them are stealthy as hiding behind a glass door. You know, they are there and they're unavoidable. The other thing I think we hadn't mentioned was the taxi tax, which is a very fun one to say, actually. Another one, ISA allowance, cut from 20k to 12k in terms of what you're allowed tax-free. But no, I have a lot of sympathy for Rachel Reeves. I think you can't not. She's got a tightrope to walk here. She has to essentially placate her backbenchers who are looking for some of these red meat policies, like the cut to the two-child benefit cap, and also trying to reassure the markets at the same time, reassure the gilt markets from going haywire. So there is a lot that needs to be juggled and balanced here. Particularly, there were a lot of U-turns in the draw up and the approach to this budget. So income tax, it was initially speculated it would have to go up the headline rate, not just the threshold. And then there was a U-turn. Income tax, it appears, will not be raised. And then the markets responded badly even to that. So it very much appears like she can't win no matter what she does. And a lot of that is communication problems. I think we've seen some more of those at this budget.
But I have sympathy for the difficult decisions she had to make over the last few weeks. I have less sympathy for the straitjacket she put herself in over the last few years. Like at the election last year, it was widely commented on that they were constraining themselves really significantly by saying they wouldn't raise income tax, national insurance, or VAT. So by saying they wouldn't do it, yes, okay, it might have won them some votes at the election or reassured or shut down some press questions. I honestly think it was mostly just to stop the press asking difficult questions. Actually, they chose to do that, and that has made their life harder. they've chosen not to go through with welfare changes that they have then had to fund at this election. So they keep on tightening the straitjacket that they're in, which means that right now I do have sympathy that she's in a really difficult position. It doesn't seem like she can win. Are the markets reassured? And by the way, we're talking an awful lot about the markets being reassured. And I think this is one of those interesting things. Who is this budget for?
Right.
It does feel like the primary audience of a budget are the markets. And I get the economics. I get the macro fiscal events and the need to ensure that gilt bonds don't get too expensive, and all those things mean that it is a confident and trusted place to invest in the UK. But actually, do we get to the fundamental principles of what we want the economy to be doing, of what we want taxation policy and benefit policy? And I've been thinking about this a bit, just trying to think back, well, actually, biblically, where do we want to get to? If we were doing these things from scratch, what would a biblical view of economic policy look like? Now, we know that Christians disagree on economic policy. Our surveys show that. Our surveys also show that people, on balance, would be willing to pay more tax to help those in greatest need. But what would it look like about debt cancellation? What would it look like about care for the vulnerable? And I think as Christians, actually, sometimes we do, and I'm a political nerd, I love it. We get sucked into the short-term political narrative. But sometimes I do want to think, actually, how can we step back and think about what are the biblical principles that we're building on, that we can then have a view where we might reach different conclusions, but we can have a view about actually how do these particular measures line up or not line up? Because otherwise it just, you get sucked into the political theatre.
I totally agree. I think some of the Jubilee and Sabbath principles in the Old Testament are really interesting on this. Everybody had a stake in the land, that there was a reset that went on every 7 years and then every 50 years. But also huge level of family responsibility. There was no welfare state. There was no, in that sense. Now, every 7 years, land was left open. You could come and go and take product from anybody's land. So there's a faith element in God. There is a looking after one another, but the extended family was the primary means of that. And so there is both. I think it treads a line somewhere between the kind of capitalist entrepreneurial aspect of you were responsible for yourself and your larger family, and a kind of socialist and kind of safety net system that also did provide in the more extreme circumstances. But I think overall, for me, some of the challenges of this is the tax take has moved to an all-time high. So we're putting more money in as taxpayers, and lower growth has really hurt our economy. And that was some of the decisions last year, I think, were very detrimental on national insurance, and some of the rates there have made that we just don't grow as much. And unless there is a bigger pie, then everybody's going to have to pay more. So the pie is fundamentally shrinking, or at least it's not growing at the same rate. So we're all having to pay more. And the subtle ways of doing that, the fiscal drag ways, if you've pointed out, Danny, is more people ultimately end up paying tax because they don't move the thresholds up as things move.
Can I just give some numbers on this? Because I did some back of an envelope maths. And it really was back of an envelope maths. So don't quote me. Go to your independent financial advisor. But what they've done by keeping the thresholds where they are means that a standard rate taxpayer will be paying £1,000 a year more tax in 2031 than they would have been in 2021. And a higher rate taxpayer will be paying £4,000 a year more tax in 2031 than they would have been paying in 2021 if the thresholds had increased pace with inflation. Because at the moment, you don't pay any tax up until about 12,500. Inflation would take that to about 17,500 by 2031. The higher rate tax would move from 50 to 70,000. So it feels like, not much is happening. But actually the impact, this is the stealth tax behind a glass door. Actually, when you start to think about the real numbers, they're not stealthy. They probably actually raise more money than putting a penny on income tax, which is why the governments like doing it, because they're very, very revenue-raising things. In 2021, 15% of the population were higher rate taxpayers. By 2031, that would be 24% of the population.
And it's worth pointing out that the top 1% of taxpayers pay 30% of all income tax. The top 10% pay 60%. I mean, we do have a progressive tax system. So the top earners pay, so top 10% pay 60% of all income tax. There are some funny moves then the government's done, like the pension cap, salary sacrifice. I mean, essentially, bit complex. Danny will give you financial advice around this, but fundamentally, there's a bit of a cap. So basically, it disincentivizes putting more into your pension through some of the schemes. It's going to, they say, raise, i.e., cost us £5 billion, and it basically, higher rate taxpayers will be less inclined to use that pension. We need people to put money into the pension, because what we're doing now is the government is paying and backing up lots of pension schemes. I mean, public sector pensions, some of the gold-plated schemes in there are, that's the conversation that's not being had around junior doctors and others, like where the levels are. Electric car mileage charge, we're getting a charge for that. So they said to everybody, go and get an electric car. I have an electric car, declare my interest. We knew this was coming, and they do more damage. It is fair in that sense, but it's less fair because they said to everybody, go this direction, and now we're going to start taxing that direction. Save for the future. Oh, but actually, we're going to charge you more. We're going to make it less. Put money into your ISA. We don't like you holding it in cash. We're going to make it so that you have to kind of invest it in the market. We're going to reduce those thresholds. Well, that's to get you to spend now to invest in companies. That's your choice. But actually, it's them trying to get more money put into the market. So basically, they're trying to, again, a sneaky way to force money out. And over 65s are protected from that, because they're always protected from everything, the older generation. And we need to have an honest conversation. The welfare proposals that we have aren't sustainable. Like, they just aren't. And the way that the triple lock on pensioners is not sustainable. I'm sorry, but my mum doesn't need half these things. It's ridiculous. So, and she's not alone. There is a generation that vote, and people need to, grey hairs like me, but older than me in reality. And they vote and they get everything given to them. And the younger generation, because they don't, are getting a raw deal. I know we didn't say anything on students this time, but I do think we need to just think. That's where I don't think it's also fair. It does privilege a generation who use their vote, and the older generation tend to get an easier ride in a lot of these. But fundamentally, the big takeaway for me, I would say, is that the pie is getting smaller, and therefore everybody's going to get taxed more. And I don't feel, and most people I speak to don't feel, they're getting better services for that. And so you're paying more for less.
It's a bit like a red flag to a bull anytime you see over 65 mentioned in an economic context. Now, there is a real danger of the government having the letter of the manifesto kept, but not the spirit of these stealth taxes. The other conversation, the bit below the top of the iceberg we're not talking about, is the national debt. So it stands at 3 trillion at the moment, which is an impossible number to conceptualize. To break it down, there are about 28.5 million houses across the UK. That's 100k per house would be paying to get down the national debt. That's insane. To bring in Peter's pension, public sector and state pension conversation, well, that sits about 5 trillion when you account for that, on top of the 3 trillion we discussed earlier. And that stands overall about, well, when you factor in the interest that we're paying on that alone, that's about 111 billion per year, which equates to 4k per house when you break it down like that. So these are just dizzying numbers, and they're very difficult to conceptualize, but they always end up reaching our pockets eventually.
They do. I think one of the things that I'm going to speak very slightly in the government's defense here, in that some of the measures are targeted at those, or the impact will be felt by those who are better off. So take the ISA change. The limit is £20,000, of which only 12,000 will now be able to be invested in a cash ISA. And then for over 65s, they can invest all of it. But if you are saving £20,000 per year, you have a reasonably high level of income. Now, obviously, there might be exceptional circumstances where you have one-off incomes that you are seeking to save, but generally, that's quite a lot to be saving per year. And the pension contribution thing and the salary sacrifice is a bit complex. I haven't quite got to the bottom of it. But this is based on your own individual contributions pre-tax. So you would need to be, if you're on a median or below income, you would have to be contributing quite a high proportion, probably over 10% of your salary per month into that pension for this to hit you. So actually it's people on higher incomes saving towards their pensions. But the disincentive towards people saving for their pensions is weird, because people do need to be encouraged to save for retirement. But I think they are trying to ensure that most of the impact of these measures are felt on people on higher incomes.
I think you guys have all been very helpful in going through a lot of what has come up and what's kind of going on. Yes, I will hold up my hands and say I am not as economic policy minded as these guys. I definitely couldn't explain fiscal drag as eloquently as Danny did last year, but it's been really helpful. But I kind of want to ask, and maybe for someone that's listening doesn't really think about the budget, they see that it's in the news, but it's not something then they're not looking forward to it in the way that we kind of are as a team. What would you say to them? Why is it important for people to engage? Why is it important for us to kind of, how do we bring biblical principles to kind of thinking about this stuff? What would you say to someone that thinks, oh, they're talking about the budget and the economy, I'm going to stop listening?
Well, the way I like to think about the budget, it's like Eurovision Song Contest Day. You don't need to understand everything that's going on, but you can still enjoy the political drama. And political drama, there is aplenty. But the other note I would say on this is that nobody really understands the big picture. And so if you're feeling as confused as I am while Rachel Reeves is talking sometimes, that's okay. It takes some other process, and there's a huge big picture here. So even just little elements that you can pick on that apply to your own life, it's important to be talking about these things and engaging with them.
Mm-hmm. And I guess then also, as you say, picking up the things that are applying to your life, but also within our church context, there'll be different things that are impacting people differently. And remembering, that congregations, we come together as a church family with very different financial situations, experiences. So I guess it's also understanding and thinking about how things are impacting someone that may be in a different situation to you.
Absolutely. I was in Sainsbury's yesterday afternoon, and someone in front of me in the queue, I could hear commenting on the fact that, there's been nothing in the news but the budget for the last 2 days. And I was like, 2 days?
Yeah.
I've been listening to podcasts talking about this for at least a month. But clearly there was oh my gosh, can't they just get it over with? Of course, money has real world impact. Some of the measures go way over my head. The report that was leaked today was the Office for Budget Responsibility's Fiscal Outlook. It's a 200-page report that goes through all the impacts. And gosh, I do not understand most of it. I'm probably at the higher end of economically literate policy. Mm-hmm. I just don't get some of this stuff. So I think it is understanding that actually it has a real world impact, and just to understand that it is complex. But I think the other thing I would say is as Christians, we need people who really do get it, who really get it, who get the consequences of economic policy, of the decisions and what it means. And I would say, actually, I do want to see Christians working in the Bank of England, in the Treasury, in banks, in financial institutions that can make decisions that are guided by biblical wisdom, that do affect all of us, even in ways we haven't got the faintest clue what it means in practice.
Yeah. I feel, and you could probably correct me, Danny, if this is wrong, but Thinking Faithfully About Politics that we launched in the lead up to the general election, the two things that came out as big evangelicals caring about most was the economy and poverty. Yeah. So people do care. And
they do care.
Yeah. So that's kind of just helpful as well, isn't it, as we think about it. But yes, I hope you've enjoyed that little financial section of the episode as we've responded to the budget. I'm sure, yes, things may well come up again in the incoming episodes, but that is our kind of initial deep dive into all that it means. You are listening to Cross Section. Thank you so much for listening or watching or engaging with us. It's great to have you here. Please do let us know what you think. Let us know your thoughts on milkshake tax or other things. We would love to hear from you. Check us out on all the kind of different social media platforms and get in touch with us at cross.section@eauk.org. It's also worth saying we've currently got a survey out. What is the survey titled?
We are wanting to hear from Christians about their experience of life in the UK. How has it changed in the last 5 years? Are they able to speak out about their faith, about their opinions? How do they feel like they're treated in their workplace as Christians? Have they been victim of a hate crime? Do they know other people who have been a victim of a hate crime based on their religious beliefs? So we'll put the survey in the show notes. It's only open for probably until next week, but we'd love to hear from as many people as possible.
Amazing. Right, I'm going to bring us into our final conversation, slightly different one from kind of what else we've been speaking about today, but something that we have covered many times before in cross-section. The CAS review came out in 2024, and that was kind of all about, puberty blockers and looking at kind of gender and children and what's happening there, and kind of issues with like the Tavistock Centre and other things like that. This week, it's been announced that there is going to be a trial by King's College London that's going to be looking at the kind of impact of puberty blockers on children. This will involve over 200 kids. This is under 16-year-olds over the next few years in this trial. Huge. And I'm sure has provoked lots of kind of reactions. It's hard to know how to process this kind of thing. Peter, I'm going to come over to you first for your initial thoughts on this is all kind of unfolded.
Yeah, look, the CAS review, incredibly helpful and very helpful globally, because it really took all the evidence together and said, look, the quote was remarkably weak evidence for puberty blockers, so recommended stopping of those. They were banned and permanently banned. It also did say, look, we need to do some research into their effectiveness. This then gets the controversial bit because you're dealing with under 16s. So very difficult to see what consent looks like. We know some of the impacts. These are off-label prostate cancer drugs being used to suppress puberty. They are used in extreme circumstances for people who puberty comes extremely early or something to kind of restrain it. So it's not that they're not used anywhere else, but here you've got somebody who would say they're experiencing gender incongruence. What does that mean? There are some clinical guidelines, but that's a pretty ambiguous thing from a medical perspective. And they will be given these drugs that have some of the implications that are certainly the concerns are that they could lead to infertility. They do have long-term implications. And this trial will have under 16s going into that. At least that will be supervised. That's the good bit. At least it will give us evidence. But I do think it's incredibly risky to ask under 16-year-olds to participate in it. And it's looking at short to medium terms. One of the biggest things is the long-term impact, the neurocognitive impact on young people. And it's not clear yet, unless they get further funding, whether they will properly examine that. And so again, it's taking huge risks with young people. I think we are in broadly a good place where these have been stopped. That was right. And that was good. And because it allows lots of other pathways to be pursued in terms of kind of counselling and working from a psychological perspective on this. The idea that this is a quick fix, I think, is a misnomer, and CAS was clear on that. I have huge hesitations about the kind of trial, but I do acknowledge that that's what CAS said. You have to find the evidence in some way, shape, or form as to whether these work or not. But strong indications are they don't, and I think this is pretty risky, and that's why we're flagging it. And lots of people do, and I think we've seen a lot of pushback. They're also not being particularly open about letting journalists in and explaining what the trial is about. So I think there's concerns from that point of view as well. And fundamentally, the government are experimenting. They're authorizing what I see as an experiment on young children in fairly vulnerable situations.
I think the big thing about CAS as well was, we need to end the experimentation on children. And if this is an experiment, it isn't a very good one either. There's no real control group. There's no group of children not being offered these drugs. The children are offered the drugs either immediately or after a year. There doesn't seem to be any safeguards at the moment. And I think the key thing about this whole new experiment is that the long-term data already exists. It is out there. In fact, there was a motion passed, a statutory instrument, to release some of this data that Tavistock held. And that data still has not been released to date. So there is a need for that evidence, and CAS was very clear about that. It does exist. It's not being released. Therefore, this trial has been given the green light. And we don't want to get into speculation, but there is, a point where we could say, if they were happy with the data that exists, why is this going ahead? As Peter has mentioned, there is just such a clear indication of long-term psychological problems with fertility that happen amongst those who take these puberty blockers. The other thing about Tavistock in particular was it was shown that the children entering it were not in a good mental frame of mind. 97.5% of those children either shared some combination of autism or depression or anxiety. And so that wasn't really being tackled at all. They were being funneled into an affirmative approach And therefore, the biggest centre in the world for children transitioning had to be closed down. And it's disappointing to see that wasn't an affirmative move. It wasn't a final move. And we've now moved on to something else.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, children as young as 10 will be involved in this. And yeah, when you don't know what the long-term consequences are, that is like deeply significant. And I think the review even said like under 18-year-olds should not be taking these things, and yet to trial them out, they're going to have to. And so, yeah, it'll be interesting. Yeah, and they won't know for years as well what's going to happen and what the impact will be. Kemi Badenoch wrote a letter to We're Streeting. It'll be interesting to kind of see in the coming days and weeks how the kind of conversation in the media continues around this and kind of what's said.
Just on the politics of it, it is interesting how strongly the Conservative Party have responded to this. Kemi Badenoch responding saying, no child is born in the wrong body. So it's interesting that it has become a very clear party position. She has been engaged on this topic since before she was leader, when she was in the government before the election. So it's not a new topic for her, but it's interesting just how aggressively they're pursuing this politically. And over the past 18 to 24 months, there has been a significant shift, and the publication of the Cass report has been part of that. There has been a change in the tone and the approach and the attitude, and a far greater hesitancy to accept this as actually, of course, supporting children to transition is part of good healthcare. That is not the automatic response you're seeing. So I think something has changed. I think it's also a bit of a reminder that actually there is still some way to go. There is still a significant pressure and groups wanting to see what you'd call trans-affirmative care and practice. And I think we and others continue to need to engage in the public square to explain what we think and to help persuade others.
Mm-hmm.
I agree, Danny, but I think one of the things in the UK that has been great is it isn't generally a left-right issue, so I totally recognise what Kemi's been doing, but J.K. Rowling being a leading voice on this and a very open Labour supporter, Hannah Barnes, formerly of Newsnight, writing in the New Statesman, one of the leading writers on this, and I like the fact that it's actually, not only is it not particularly left and right in the UK, but it's Christian and non-Christian are often agreeing on this, so while we've put our transformed resource out and said what we understand to be made in the image of God, and male and female, actually culture, if you like, in reality is aligning with that view. And so the creational reality is kind of striking back. And so it's been an interesting topic for us to be engaged in. I look at our subjects today and we're looking at the role of religion, if you like, in schools, RE, and how foundational it is to our schooling system. Our schooling and healthcare system all came originally from Christians and churches, and they were a gift, if you like, into the public square. I look at even the Rutger Bregman and his lecture at the minute. He's looking for a moral revolution. And one of the questions the audience asked was, what morals are you basing this on? And he said he'll come to that in the future. But that, for me, is one of these questions that we have going forward. We look at the morality of the budget and we look at the morality of puberty blockers. And we're saying, yeah, we have a better story and we have a framework in which we're engaging. And I do think it's fascinating. So many of these cultural conversations are coming right into this space. And the role of faith is being seen in a radically different way right now. And actually, we're way more in these conversations than maybe it was the case before. It felt like you were on the edges just trying to kind of, hi, can we get in, please? Now it's like right at the core, ethics, values, morality. What a fantastic place to be having these conversations. And I think it's why each of us love doing cross-section.
Yeah. Three big stories that are relevant to us as Christians and we can speak into for different reasons. I think Peter was really helpful in kind of bringing those things together. But yeah, I just wanted to say thank you to all three of you for your contributions, your wisdom. These are all things that we will continue to engage with. But I really recommend you read some more of the resources that we have linked below. If you've not looked at Transform before, do have a look at that. Enjoy kind of thinking further about some of these conversations because they are so important. But for now, thank you so much for watching and see you next week.